year was 1881, and the land held its breath. On the vast, wind-scoured plains of the Dakota Territory, autumn was not a gentle decline into slumber, but a fierce, final burning. The prairie grass, once a sea of green, had been baked to the color of old bone, and the sky stretched over it all, a dome of infinite, indifferent blue. In the center of this immensity sat the farm of Elias Hale, a place so small and quiet it seemed in danger of being erased by the sheer scale of the landscape. The farm was a testament to failure, a monument to a dream that had died. The sod house, dark and damp, slumped into the earth as if weary of standing. The fields, broken by hand and plough, had yielded a crop so meager it was more mockery than harvest. Loneliness was the true crop here, and it grew in suffocating abundance. It had been 3 years since Martha was taken by the fever, 3 years since the silence she left behind had become a physical presence in the small cabin, a weight on Elias's chest that made each breath an effort. Elias moved through his days like a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. He was a tall man, stooped now not just by labor, but by sorrow. His hands, calloused and cracked, knew the language of work, but his heart had forgotten the language of hope. He had a single horse, an old grey gelding named Ben, whose swayback and cloudy eyes mirrored his own exhaustion. Ben was more than livestock. He was the last living link to a past that held warmth and laughter. He was the horse Elias and Martha had bought together, the one that had pulled the wagon carrying all their worldly possessions, their future packed into splintered crates and canvas bundles. Now he was just a tool, the four-legged engine that pulled the plough through resistant soil and, once a season, drew the small wagon to the dusty outpost of redemption, a town that had never lived up to its name. The routine was a merciless metronome, ticking off the empty days. Rise before the sun painted the eastern horizon in shades of rose and regret. Milk the one scrawny cow. Mend the fence that the wind perpetually tried to reclaim. Work the stubborn earth. Eat a solitary meal of beans and stale bread. Stare into the fire until the embers died, seeing Martha's face in the shifting glow. Sleep, repeat. It was a life of stasis, a quiet desperation held in check only by the sheer, grinding necessity of survival. He had come here for a future, for a piece of the world to call his own. He had ended up with a patch of dirt that owned him, body and soul. One evening, as the sun bled its last light across the prairie, bruising the sky into nightfall, Elias was walking the perimeter of his property. It was a habit born of restlessness, a need to pace the boundaries of his cage. The wind howled like a thing grieving, a sound that usually sank into his bones and echoed his own emptiness. But tonight, it carried something else, a different sound, low and pained, almost lost in the keening of the wind. He stopped, head cocked, listening. It came again, a human sound of pure misery. His first instinct, honed by years of solitude and the harsh tales that drifted out of town, was one of fear. The world beyond his fence was not kind, but a deeper instinct, a remnant of the man he had been when Martha was alive, stirred within him. He followed the sound, his boots crunching over the dry, brittle grass. He found him near a shallow ravine, half hidden by a cluster of stubborn sagebrush. A man, face down in the dirt, still and silent, save for the ragged breaths that shuddered through his body. He was Native American, his dark hair matted with blood and dirt, his deerskin clothing torn and stained. A deep, ugly gash ran down his leg, the bone showing white and stark through the mangled flesh. An arrow, broken off, protruded from his shoulder. He was close to death. Elias stood frozen, a war raging within him. The people in Redemption spoke of the Lakota with a mixture of fear and hatred. They were savages, thieves, a threat to be driven out or exterminated. Garrett Shaw, the man who ran the general store and held the town's opinion in his meaty fist, would say to leave him. Let the coyotes have him. It would be one less to worry about. To bring this man back to his farm was to invite trouble, perhaps even violence. upon himself. But then the man groaned again, a sound stripped of all pride and defiance, a raw plea to the uncaring sky. Elias saw not a warrior, not a threat, but a fellow creature in agony. He saw a man as alone and broken as he was. In that moment, the judgment of the world, the fear, the prejudice, all fell away, leaving only a simple human imperative. He could not leave him to die. It was a choice that went against all logic of self-preservation, but it felt like the first real decision he had made in 3 years. With a grunt of effort, Elias knelt. He gently turned the man over. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with pain, but they held a spark of awareness, of fierce, cornered pride. Elias saw the tension in the man's jaw, the way his hand twitched towards a knife that was no longer at his belt. "I mean you no harm," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. The words felt strange in his mouth. "You're hurt bad. Let me help you." The man's eyes narrowed, searching Elias's face. He gave no sign of understanding the words, but he must have understood the tone. After a long, silent moment that stretched into the deepening twilight, a flicker of something resignation, or perhaps a gamble on trust passed through his gaze. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Getting him back to the cabin was an ordeal. The man was solidly built, and even with Elias supporting most of his weight, every step was a journey through a landscape of pain. By the time they reached the sod house, both were trembling with exhaustion, their sweat mingling with the stranger's blood. Elias eased him onto the spare cot, the one that had been Martha's. The irony was a bitter pill. He lit the lantern, the soft yellow light pushing back the shadows and revealing the full extent of the injuries. They were worse than he'd thought. Elias was no doctor, but he had set his own broken bones and stitched his own wounds. He worked with a grim focus, his hands, clumsy with grief, rediscovering a forgotten gentleness. He cleaned the leg wound as best he could with boiled water and tore strips from one of Martha's old linen sheets for bandages. The most difficult part was the arrow. The head was buried deep in the muscle of the shoulder. He knew it had to come out. He heated the blade of his hunting knife in the lantern's flame until it glowed red. He looked at the man, who watched his every move, his face a mask of stoicism. "This is going to hurt," Elias said, though he knew the warning was useless. He handed the man a thick piece of leather. The man took it, his eyes never leaving Elias's, and clamped it between his teeth. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the hiss of the knife, the man's sharp intake of breath, and the low, guttural sound of pain he could not entirely suppress. When it was over, and the arrowhead lay on the floor, both men were slick with sweat. Elias packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow he'd gathered, a remedy an old trapper had once taught him, and bandaged it tightly. The man's eyes were closed now, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. He had lost consciousness. Elias pulled a thin blanket over him and collapsed into his own chair, the silence of the room now shared, altered, and charged with a new, uncertain weight. The days that followed settled into a new, tense routine. The stranger, whose name Elias did not know, drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. Elias tended to him with a quiet diligence, changing his bandages, forcing sips of broth and water between his cracked lips. The presence of another person in the house was profoundly unsettling. It was an intrusion into the hermetically sealed world of his grief. Every glance at the figure on the cot was a reminder of his rash decision, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. When the fever broke, the man's eyes cleared. He watched Elias with an unnerving intensity, his gaze missing nothing. He was like a hawk brought low, wounded, but with his wildness and pride undiminished. Communication was a bridge built of gestures and guesswork. Elias would point to the water bucket, and the man would nod. The man would touch his bandages, and Elias would bring fresh ones. They were two islands in a sea of silence, shouting at each other across the void with their hands and their eyes. Slowly, the man began to heal. He started to sit up, his movements stiff and pained. One afternoon, while Elias was mending a harness, the man gestured for the piece of wood Elias had discarded and the knife he used for whittling. Elias passed them over, curious. For hours the man worked, his long fingers surprisingly deft. By evening, the block of wood had been transformed into the small, perfect figure of a soaring eagle. He held it out to Elias. It wasn't a payment, it felt like something more, a statement, a recognition. Elias took the carving, his rough fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wings. He looked at the man and saw, for the first time, not just a wounded stranger but an artist, a creator. He nodded his thanks and placed the eagle on the mantelpiece, beside the faded photograph of Martha. It didn't look out of place. That night, a tentative conversation began. The man pointed to his own chest. "Chaitin," he said. The name was strong, like a stone. Elias pointed to himself. "Elias." Chaitin nodded. He used a piece of charcoal from the fire to draw on the floor. He drew mountains, a river, and then a large circle of tipis, his people. He then drew a line of stick figures with rifles and an X over a figure that was clearly him, an ambush. He had been left for dead. The simple drawings told a story of violence and loss that needed no translation. Elias, moved by the silent confession, found himself speaking. He pointed to the photograph on the mantel. "Martha," he said, the name a painful whisper. "My wife." He drew a simple cross beside a drawing of a house. Chaitin looked from the drawing to Elias's face, and in his dark eyes, Elias saw an echo of his own sorrow. Understanding. In that moment, the chasm between them narrowed. They were just two men, marked by loss, sharing the quiet dark. As Chaitin grew stronger, a fragile camaraderie took root in the barren soil of Elias's farm. Chaitin began to move about, first limping around the cabin, then venturing outside. He showed Elias how to read the subtle signs of the land, how to find water, which plants were medicine and which were poison. He was a natural teacher, his instructions conveyed through patient pantomime. They shared meals that were no longer silent and tense, but punctuated by the quiet language they had built. Elias found himself smiling, a strange and unfamiliar sensation that felt like a rusty hinge being forced open. The crushing weight of loneliness had lessened, its edges softened by companionship. But as autumn bled into the colder days of late fall, a new tension grew. Chaitin's gaze turned increasingly to the north, a restless energy building in him. He knew he had to leave. His people would think him dead. The journey was long, and winter was coming, a predator stalking the plains. He was strong enough to travel, but not on foot, not with enemies who might still be searching for him. One evening, he made his need known. He drew a horse on the dirt floor, then a long, winding path leading to the mountains and the circle of tipis. He looked at Elias, his expression grave. He was asking for the one thing Elias could not afford to give. Old Ben was everything. He was the plough, the wagon, the only means of getting the meager grain to market. He was the difference between holding on and starving. To give him away was to sign the deed of the farm over to the wind and the winter snows. It was suicide. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. All the progress, all the fragile connection they had built, had led to this impossible choice. He could say no. He would be justified. No one would ask a man to give away his own survival. The next day, Garrett Shaw rode out from Redemption, his presence a dark blot on the pale landscape. He had heard whispers, he said, his small eyes full of suspicion. Rumors of smoke from Elias's chimney at odd hours, of two shadows seen where there should only be one. "You're a fool if you're harboring one of them, Hale," Shaw said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "They're animals. They'll slit your throat for a crust of bread. The army's been clearing them out for a reason. You'd do well to remember which side you're on." The threat was unspoken but clear. Shaw's words were meant to poison the air, to remind Elias of the rigid, hateful lines drawn between his world and Chaitin's, but the warning had the opposite effect. It solidified Elias's resolve. He had seen the humanity in Chaitan, the honor, the shared grief. Shaw and his kind saw only a stereotype, a thing to be feared and hated. To refuse Chaitan now would be to agree with them, to betray the quiet truth that had grown between the two men in the small sod house. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the cold hearth, the carved eagle in his hand. He thought of Martha's kindness, her belief that a man's worth was measured not by what he had, but by what he was willing to give. He thought of the crushing loneliness that had been his only companion, and the brief, welcome reprieve Chaitan's presence had brought. Giving away his horse was madness, it was ruin. But keeping him and sending Chaitan away to face a near-certain death on the prairie felt like a deeper kind of ruin, a ruin of the soul. In the cold, grey light of dawn, he made his decision. He walked to the small, lean-to stable where Ben stood, his warm breath steaming in the air. Elias rested his forehead against the old horse's neck, his throat tight. "Goodbye, old friend," he whispered. He led Ben out to where Chaitan stood waiting, a small bundle of provisions in his hand. Chaitan saw the horse, and his eyes widened slightly. He looked from the horse to Elias, a profound, questioning look on his face. He knew what this cost. Elias simply held out the reins. He could not speak. The gesture said everything. Chaitan took the leather straps, his hand brushing Elias's. He looked Elias square in the eye, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical force. He placed a hand over his own heart, a solemn, powerful gesture of oath. There were no words of thanks, no promises of repayment. None were needed. The promise was in his eyes, a vow as deep and unyielding as the land itself. Then, with a grace that belied his recent injuries, he swung himself onto Ben's back. He gave one last, lingering look at Elias and the small, failing farm. Then he turned the horse north and rode away, not looking back. Elias watched until he was just a speck, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. Then he was alone again, truly alone. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, thick with the echo of his monumental, foolish act. He stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping at his thin coat, feeling the full, crushing weight of what he had done. The months that followed were a slow descent into despair. Winter arrived with a vengeance, burying the prairie under a thick shroud of white. Without Ben, Elias was crippled. He couldn't haul firewood from the creek bed, couldn't make the trip to town for supplies. He survived on his meager stores, growing thinner and more gaunt with each passing week. The farm, which had been failing before, was now dead. The snow drifted up against the walls of the sod house, isolating him completely. He was a man on an island in a sea of snow. The townsfolk, he was sure, were smugly satisfied. Garrett Shaw had likely spread the story of the fool farmer who gave his only horse to an Indian. Elias Hale, the man who chose a savage over his own survival. He was forgotten, written off, a cautionary tale whispered over cracker barrels in the warmth of the general store. He spent most of his days huddled by the fire, feeding it with pieces of the fence he could break apart. The carved eagle on the mantel was his only company. He would hold it, feeling the smooth wood, and remember the quiet dignity of the man who had made it. He did not regret his choice, not in his heart. But his body, aching with cold and hunger, screamed that he was a fool. As the last of his food dwindled, he resigned himself to the inevitable. The farm had claimed him after all. He would be another unmarked grave for the spring thaw to reveal. One afternoon, when the sun was a pale, watery disk in a pewter sky, he heard it, a sound. At first he thought it was the wind, or a trick of his starved mind. But it grew, a low, rumbling thunder that seemed to vibrate up from the frozen earth itself. It was the sound of hooves, hundreds of them. He staggered to the door, his heart hammering with a terrifying hope. He pushed it open, squinting against the blinding glare of the snow. In the distance, coming over the rise, was a sight so impossible it had to be a hallucination. It was a river of horses, A massive, churning herd, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their coats 100 different shades of brown and black and roan. And leading them, riding a powerful paint stallion, was Chaitan. He was no longer the wounded refugee. He wore the proud regalia of a Lakota leader, his presence radiating a quiet authority that seemed to command the very landscape. Behind him rode 7 young women, their faces bright against the winter cold, their dark braids adorned with beads that caught the weak sunlight. They handled their mounts with an easy, innate skill, their posture straight and proud. The herd flowed around the small sod house, filling the empty fields with life and movement and sound. They stopped a short distance away, and the sudden silence was as stunning as the noise had been. Chaitan dismounted and walked towards Elias, his moccasins making no sound on the packed snow. He stopped before the stunned farmer, who could only stare, speechless. The man who gave his only horse to a stranger deserves to have a horse for every day of the year, and more, Chaitan said. His English was clear, learned. Elias realized, in a life before the ambush, a life he had never spoken of. These are from my herds, 500 of our best. They are yours. Elias could not form words. He looked from Chaitan's serene face to the sea of horses, to the 7 women who watched him with curious, dark eyes. It was too much to comprehend. Chaitan gestured to the women. "My daughters," he said, a deep pride in his voice. "This is Winona, my eldest. And Istas, Wachiwi, Zitkala, Wakinyela, Zina, and Tayan." Winona, a young woman with her father's solemn eyes and a gentle strength in her face, dismounted and came forward. She held out a leather bundle. "My father said you were a man of honor who lived alone. He said your home was quiet. We have brought food, and we will help you bring order to this gift." Elias finally found his voice, a choked rasp. I don't understand." "You gave me back my life," Chaitan said simply. "You gave me back to my family. My debt is great. This is only the beginning of its payment. You are a brother to me, Elias Hale, and my family is now your family." The days that followed were a whirlwind of transformation. The silent, desolate farm became a hub of vibrant life. Chaitan's daughters, led by the capable Winona, were a force of nature. They were not delicate flowers. They were strong, resilient women of the plains. They moved with purpose and grace, their laughter and chatter filling the air, a sound Elias had not heard in years. They helped him build a proper corral for the horses. They tanned hides, repaired the cabin, and cooked meals over a roaring fire, filling the small home with the rich smells of roasted meat and herbs. They taught him their words for the sky and the wind, and he taught them the names of his tools. They were a bridge between 2 worlds, built right on his doorstep. Chaitan stayed for a week, overseeing the transfer of his gift and solidifying the bond he had declared. He and Elias would sit by the fire at night, no longer needing to draw in the dirt. Chaitan spoke of his people's struggles, of the treaty lands being stolen, of the fight to preserve their way of life. Elias spoke of Martha, of his hopes for the farm, of the grief that had hollowed him out. They spoke as brothers. When Chaitan left, he did not leave Elias alone. He left his 7 daughters. "They will stay until the spring planting," he announced. "They will teach you the ways of the horse, and they will ensure that this new life takes root." The winter passed not in desperation, but in discovery. Elias, who had been shrinking into himself, began to stand taller. The stoop in his shoulders lessened. He learned the rhythm of life with a large family, the easy give and take, the shared work and shared meals. He watched Winona gentle, a wild mare with a patience and intuition that was nothing short of magical. He learned from Istas how to read the winter sky, and from Wachiwi how to track game in the snow. His farm was no longer a patch of dirt. It was a ranch, rich with the finest horses on the plains. His sod house, once a tomb of sorrow, was now a home, filled with warmth and life. He had offered a dying man his only horse, an act of foolish, desperate kindness, and in return he had been given not just wealth, but a world. He had been given a family. He had been given back his own life, reborn from the ashes of grief into a future he could never have imagined, a future that galloped towards him on 500 pairs of thundering hooves. The land no longer held its breath in indifference. It exhaled, and its breath was the warm, sweet scent of a spring thaw and the promise of a new beginning.